Have you ever stopped to question the way society teaches us about money? From childhood, we're told to get good grades, go to college, find a stable job, work hard, and save a portion of our income until we're old enough to retire. On the surface, this formula sounds safe, even wise. But if it's so effective, why do so many people still struggle financially even after following this exact path? Most schools teach us algebra, literature, and history, but rarely do they teach us how to manage money. We graduate knowing how to write essays and solve equations, but we remain completely unprepared for credit cards, taxes, investing, or how to build wealth. Financial literacy isn't just a gap in knowledge, it's a trap. It keeps people stuck in cycles of debt, stress, and scarcity. This is the reality that Robert Kiyosaki, a young boy growing up in Hawaii, began to notice early in his life. What made his experience unique was that he had not one, but two father figures who deeply influenced his worldview. His biological father, whom he called his poor dad, and the father of his best friend, his rich dad. These two men couldn't have been more different. One held a PhD and valued academic achievement above all else. The other never finished 8th grade, but understood money as very few did. One encouraged Robert to get a secure government job and climb the corporate ladder. The other urged him to become an entrepreneur and make money work for him. Over the years, Robert found himself caught between two conflicting sets of advice. Both fathers were intelligent, both cared for him, and both were trying to help him succeed. But only one of them was financially free. This story isn't just about two men, it's about two mindsets. It's about the ideas that keep people poor versus the principles that help people become wealthy. It's about understanding the difference between working for money and having money work for you. In the chapters that follow, we'll explore what Robert learned from each father. We'll unpack the lessons that led him to escape the rat race and build financial freedom. Whether you're a student, a working professional, or someone starting over in life, this story might just challenge what you thought you knew and open a door to a new way of thinking about success, money, and freedom. Because sometimes it takes two fathers to truly understand the meaning of wealth. From the outside, both of Robert's father figures seemed respectable, responsible men. They were both hardworking, principled, and deeply cared for their families. But as Robert grew up, observing their decisions, listening to their advice, and watching the outcomes of their lives, he began to notice a stark divide between the two. This divide wasn't just about how much money they earned, it was about how they thought about money. Robert's poor dad was his biological father, highly educated man with advanced degrees and a solid job working for the state. He had followed the traditional path, excel in school, graduate with honors, and work his way up through the system. Got a steady paycheck, benefits, a pension plan, and the respect of his peers. His values were shaped by academia, stability, and loyalty to an employer. To poor dad, job security was the ultimate goal. He believed that climbing the ladder of promotions and increasing his salary over time was the key to a comfortable life. He advised Robert to work hard, avoid making mistakes, and never question authority. He genuinely believed that being employed by a big, secure company or the government was the smartest financial move one could make. However, despite his intelligence and commitment, poor dad always seemed to struggle financially. Every month, money came in and money went out. Bills piled up, taxes took their share, and the family rarely had much left to invest or save. His income rose over time, but so did his expenses. Poor dad lived in a constant state of financial tension. He was a good man with a strong work ethic, but financially, he felt trapped. In contrast, rich dad was not what most people would traditionally consider educated. He'd never finished high school. But what he lacked in formal education, he more than made up for with financial intelligence. Rich dad was a businessman, investor, and entrepreneur. He owned multiple small companies, invested in properties, and was always looking for opportunities to grow his wealth, not by working more hours, but by making his money work for him. Rich dad believed that job security was a myth. Him depending on a single source of income, your job was risky. He taught Robert that true security came from understanding how money works, how to invest wisely, and how to build systems that generated income, whether you worked or not. Our poor dad said, study hard so you can find a good company to work for. Rich dad said, study how money works so you can build a company of your own. Poor dad believed that saving money and living frugally was the key to wealth. Rich dad believed that learning to invest and create cash flowing assets was far more powerful. Poor dad warned money is the root of all evil. Rich dad corrected the lack of money is the root of all evil. Poor dad believed talking about money was impolite. Rich dad believed financial education should be a daily conversation. Robert often found himself torn. He loved and respected both fathers, and each had valid arguments in their own way. But as time went on, Robert began noticing something hard to ignore: the results. Poor dad, with all his degrees and credentials, was always worried about money. He had a stable job, but no real financial freedom. Rich dad, on the other hand, was relaxed, optimistic, and growing wealthier year after year. He controlled his time, traveled freely, and wasn't bound by a paycheck. Robert slowly came to a realization that would change the course of his life. Success wasn't just about working hard, it was about thinking differently. He started asking himself questions that most kids never thought to ask. Why do some people work their entire lives but never get ahead? Why do others build wealth even without formal education? Why does one kind of education lead to security while the other leads to freedom? This was when Robert decided to become a student, not just of school subjects, but of money itself. He would continue learning from both dads, but it was Rich Dad's way of thinking that began to shape his path. The contrast between these two father figures wasn't about who was better. It was about who understood the rules of the financial game and who didn't even know a game was being played. That's when Robert discovered the real lesson. If you want to be financially free, you can't just rely on hard work and good grades. You have to learn how money works and then use that knowledge to make money work for you. One of the most eye-opening concepts that Rich Dad taught Robert was something he called the rat race. It's a cycle so common, so familiar that most people don't even recognize they're stuck in it. Yet it's a trap that keeps millions working hard their entire lives, never truly getting ahead, only surviving. It goes like this. You go to school, get good grades, and graduate. You land a job, start earning a steady paycheck. With your newfound income, you rent a nicer apartment, buy a car, and maybe celebrate with some new clothes. Then comes the bills, rent, insurance, car payments, phone plans, credit cards. Before you know it, most or even all of your paycheck is gone. Then you think, if I just made a little more, everything would be easier. So you work harder, maybe earn a promotion, and now you're bringing in $4,000 instead of $3.00 a month. But instead of investing that difference, you upgrade your lifestyle again. A bigger home, better car, more eating out. Expenses rise to meet income. The race continues. Rich Dad explained that most people don't have a money problem. They have a behavior problem. They keep buying liabilities thinking they're assets. They believe the problem is not enough income, when in fact, the real issue is not enough financial education. Robert was just a teenager when he began noticing this pattern, not just in strangers, but in the people closest to him. His poor dad had a respectable job, a steady salary, but seemed constantly under stress. There was always another expense: taxes, school fees, home repairs. Every month was a juggling act to make ends meet. Meanwhile, Rich Dad seemed to live with more ease. He wasn't working longer hours, often the opposite. But his businesses and investments kept generating money even when he was spending time with family or playing golf. His money worked for him. One day, Robert asked Rich Dad, why does it feel like no matter how hard people work, they never get ahead? Rich Dad replied, because they were trained to become employees, not owners. School rewards people for following instructions and avoiding mistakes. But in the real world, wealth is built by those who take calculated risk, think creatively, and are not afraid to fail. He explained that most people are financially reactive, not proactive. They earn money and immediately plan how to spend it. The wealthy, on the other hand, ask, how can I use this money to create more income? They delay gratification and prioritize long-term gain over short-term pleasure. To make it clear, Rich Dad drew a simple diagram for Robert. Job, income, expenses, more work. This wasn't the rat race. And for most people, it never ends. Robert could already feel its pull. He saw it everywhere. And in the teachers who worked 30 years only to retire with too little, in the neighbors who looked rich but were drowning in credit card debt. The graduates were burdened with student loans before they even earned their first paycheck. It was sobering, but also empowering, because once Robert saw the rat race, he realized he could choose to step off the wheel. The first step, Rich Dad said, was to stop chasing a paycheck and start building assets. That's how the rich escape the rat race. They don't trade time for money forever. They invest time in acquiring or creating things that pay them continuously. Businesses, real estate, intellectual property, and other income-generating assets. Robert realized that getting a raise wouldn't solve the problem. Controlling expenses wouldn't either, at least not on its own. The real solution was to change his relationship with money, to stop thinking like a consumer and start thinking like an investor. Stop asking, how can I afford this now? And start asking, how can I create something that pays for this later? That was his first awakening, not just to how money works, but to how the system trains people to stay stuck unless they choose to learn, to question, and to build their own path. After Robert's realization about the rat race, Rich Dad introduced him to one of the most powerful yet misunderstood concepts in personal finance: the difference between assets and liabilities. This concept, Rich Dad said, was the core reason why the rich kept getting richer while the poor and middle class remained stuck. An asset, Rich Dad explained, is something that puts money into your pocket. A liability is something that takes money out of your pocket. It sounded simple, too simple. But as Robert dug deeper, he saw that most people either misunderstood this or completely ignored it. And take, for example, a house. Many people consider their personal home to be their biggest asset. It's where they live. It has value. It might even appreciate over time. But from Rich Dad's perspective, unless that house was generating income, such as through rental, it was actually a liability. Why? Because it constantly pulled money out of your pocket: mortgage payments, property taxes, maintenance, insurance, and repairs. It didn't pay, it cost you. Robert was stunned. He had grown up thinking that owning a home was the American dream, a symbol of success. But now he realizes that what looks like wealth and what actually builds wealth are two very different things. To make this more concrete, Rich Dad gave Robert two detailed examples. Now, case one, buying a car. A young man saves $10,000, 0 cents, and decides to reward himself with a shiny new car. He drives it proudly through the neighborhood, feeling successful. But within days, the car starts costing him money: gas, insurance, registration fees, regular maintenance and repairs. Worse, the car starts depreciating the moment he drives it off the lot. Over time, its value drops to half or less of what he paid. Despite how it makes him feel emotionally, the car is a liability. Case two, investing in a small rental property. Another young man saves the same $10,000, 0 cents, but instead uses it as a down payment on a small property. It's not flashy, maybe a modest one-bedroom unit, but he rents it out for $500, 0 cents a month. After expenses, he nets $200, 0 cents monthly. Over time, the property appreciates and rent increases. That $10,000 cents now works for him, producing money each month and growing in value. That's an asset. Robert realized that the wealthy operate from a very different rule book. While most people used money to buy things, the rich used money to acquire assets. And when those assets produced enough income, they used that money, not their salary, to fund luxuries. Rich Dad summarized it simply: the poor buy stuff, the middle class buys liabilities they think are assets. The rich buy assets first and then use the income from those assets to buy luxuries. Even high income doesn't guarantee wealth. Rich Dad reminded Robert that many professionals, doctors, lawyers, engineers, make six figures yet remain broke. Why? Because they don't acquire assets. They have big houses, expensive cars, private school bills, and costly vacations, but no passive income. They're high earners, yes, but they're also high spenders, deeply entrenched in the rat race. Robert started seeing the world differently. He no longer admired people based on what they owned, but rather on how they earned and used their money. That man with the Rolex, the luxury car, did he pay for it with passive income, or did he put himself in debt to impress others? That woman who lived modestly but owned 4 rental properties, she might be richer than anyone on her block. Rich Dad encouraged Robert to track his own money flow. Each dollar you spend or invest is like an employee. The question is, are you sending your money out to work for you or to serve someone else's dream? Over time, Robert began to see money not as a reward, but as a tool. Every dollar saved with a soldier, every asset acquired was a productive employee, and every liability was a leak, money slipping away quietly while he wasn't watching. The goal, Rich Dad emphasized, was not to look rich, but to be rich. Real wealth wasn't flashy. It was quiet, strategic, and often invisible. It was built slowly and protected fiercely. And it always began with understanding this one simple truth: assets make you money. Liabilities cost you money. And knowing the difference would determine your financial destiny. Once Robert understood the difference between assets and liabilities, his worldview began to shift. But there was another subtler difference that Rich Dad wanted him to see, a difference in mindset, especially in the kinds of questions people ask themselves. Poor Dad often said things like, "We can't afford that," or "Money doesn't grow on trees." Rich Dad, in contrast, never accepted limits, only challenges. His favorite phrase was, "How can I afford it?" This small change in language made a huge difference in results. When someone says, "I can't afford it," their mind shuts down. The brain hears a final decision, not a problem to be solved. But when someone asks, "How can I afford it?" the brain shifts into solution mode. It starts searching for possibilities, options, and strategies. For example, if Robert wanted to buy something expensive, poor Dad would respond with disapproval or even guilt. Do you really need that? It's to be responsible. He would view desire as reckless, even shameful. Rich Dad took a different approach. If Robert wanted something beyond his current means, he didn't shut it down. He leaned in. "Interesting," he'd say. "So what could you do to generate enough money for that without touching your savings or salary?" It wasn't about indulgence. It was about developing creativity and resourcefulness. This taught Robert a critical lesson. Wealth starts in the mind. The rich weren't just wealthier in bank accounts. They were wealthier in thought, in confidence, and in problem solving. They believed they could find a way. That belief shaped their actions, and their actions shaped their reality. Rich Dad gave Robert an exercise. Every time you want something but think you can't afford it, write down at least 3 ways you might be able to make it happen. Robert tried it. For example, when he wanted to buy a new bike, instead of asking his parents, he brainstormed tips to, could I do yard work in the neighborhood and save up? Could I offer tutoring to younger kids? Could I buy and resell baseball cards for profit? That exercise became a habit. Over time, Robert learned to think in terms of value creation. Instead of what job should I get, he asked, what problem can I solve? Instead of how much do I earn, he focused on how much can I keep and multiply. Rich Dad explained that most people stay poor not because they lack intelligence, but because they accept their current circumstances as permanent. They let fear dictate their choices and they stop asking questions. Like he also emphasized that mindset isn't magic. It must be paired with knowledge and action. Dreaming big is important, but unless you back that dream with skill and effort, it's just fantasy. People who think like the wealthy aren't waiting to be rescued. They're not hoping for a raise or a lottery ticket. They build income streams. They study markets. They learn how to protect and grow what they have. And they're always asking better questions. By shifting his inner dialogue, Robert was no longer limited by his family's income or background. He had learned how to unlock opportunity with a single phrase. How can I afford it? And that Rich Dad said was the real secret. The rich don't think with their wallets. They think with their minds. And that makes all the difference. When most people think about money, they think in numbers: income, expenses, debt, savings. But Rich Dad taught Robert something far deeper. Money is emotional. And unless you learn to manage your emotions, you will always be a slave to money, no matter how much you earn. There are two emotions that dominate financial decisions, Rich had said: fear and desire. Fear keeps people stuck. It's the reason someone stays in a job they hate. It's why they don't invest even when they know they should. Fear whispers, what if you lose everything? What if people laugh at you? What if you fail? Rich Dad explained that most people fear being broke far more than they desire to be rich. As fear drives them to play it safe, get a stable job, stick to what they know, and avoid any financial risk. But ironically, this fear leads them right into the rat race. They trade their time for money, hoping for security, but never build the knowledge or assets to escape that cycle. Then there's desire, or as Rich Dad called it, the illusion of wealth. Desire makes people buy things they can't afford, thinking it will bring happiness or status. It's the emotional high of buying a new phone, car, or branded watch. But after the thrill fades, all that remains is another monthly payment. People spend their whole lives caught between these two forces, the fear of having too little and the desire for too much. The result: financial stress, poor decisions, and a constant feeling of not enough. Rich Dad didn't say you should eliminate emotions. In fact, he believed that emotions are natural and even necessary. But he emphasized one thing: feel them, but don't obey them blindly. He taught Robert that when fear shows up, fear of investing, fear of starting a business, fear of speaking about money, the best response is to pause, analyze, and then act strategically, not impulsively. One of his favorite sayings was, "The poor let emotions control them. The rich control emotions with knowledge." Knowledge, Rich Dad said, is the antidote to fear. When you understand how money works, how taxes, debt, investing, and cash flow function, you no longer fear the unknown. You can assess risk rationally. You can prepare for challenges. You can take action with confidence, not panic. He gave an example. When markets crash, most people sell in fear, but the wealthy see opportunity. They buy assets at a discount, well, not because they have stronger nerves, but because they've studied the game and trust the long-term value. Robert saw the difference firsthand. Poor Dad avoided financial discussions, too stressful. Rich Dad welcomed them. He wasn't fearless, he was informed, and that made all the difference. This lesson stayed with Robert throughout his life. He realized that financial confidence doesn't come from how much you earn. It comes from how well you understand and manage your money, your risks, and your emotions. After learning to manage fear and desire, Robert realized there was another layer to wealth that Rich Dad had been quietly instilling in him all along: habits. While knowledge builds understanding, it is consistent action, anchored in daily behavior, that creates lasting financial freedom. Success, Rich Dad said, is not the result of one big decision. It's the sum of small, smart decisions made every single day. He taught Robert one of the most powerful financial habits: pay yourself first. Before spending on rent, bills, or even food, Robert was told to set aside a portion of his income, no matter how small, for investing or saving. This wasn't always easy. Sometimes the amount seemed insignificant. Sometimes other obligations screamed louder. But over time, this habit rewired Robert's thinking. Instead of spending first and saving what was left, he learned to prioritize his future over his impulses. Rich Dad explained that the discipline of saving wasn't about deprivation, it was about control. It sent a message to your subconscious: My future matters more than my short-term desires. This mental shift, when practiced over weeks, months, and years, built a mindset of ownership and confidence. Another habit was tracking expenses. Most people, Rich Dad said, have no idea where their money goes. They work hard, get paid, and by month's end, it's all gone. But when you track every dollar, you gain awareness. And awareness breeds control. You start seeing patterns, leaks, and opportunities. Robert was also encouraged to develop the habit of daily learning. Rich Dad told him to read books on investing, business, psychology, and economics. You don't need to be an expert overnight. But if you improve just 1% a day, you'll be 37 times better in a year. Rich Dad believed in compounding, not just for money, but for knowledge and behavior. The earlier you start, the more powerful the results become over time. He shared the story of a young woman who earned very little, but committed to saving and investing $50.00 a month. Over time, those small seeds grew into rental properties, then a business, and eventually financial independence. Not because she was lucky or highly paid, but because she was consistent. That's when Robert realized it's not how much you make, it's what you do with what you have and how often you do it. Wealth doesn't begin with a lottery win or a miracle investment. It begins with a simple decision repeated daily. Choose growth over comfort. Choose your future over impulse. As Robert's financial journey progressed, Rich Dad began sharing lessons that went beyond money. He believed that wealth wasn't just about accumulating assets. It was about living with purpose, sharing value, and ultimately creating impact. You don't become truly rich, Rich Dad said, until you start giving back. At first, Robert didn't understand, why would someone give away money they worked so hard to build? Wouldn't that make them poorer? But Rich Dad smiled. Money is like energy. The more you circulate it with intention, the more it grows. The wealthiest people I know aren't the ones who hoard. They're the ones who create value and uplift others. They gave Robert an example of a businessman who, after building his fortune, started a scholarship fund for underprivileged students. Not only did the fund change hundreds of lives, it brought the businessman respect, new relationships, and business partnerships he never expected. Generosity had opened doors that money alone could not. Rich Dad explained that true abundance comes from contribution. When you help others grow, you grow too. When you mentor someone, you reinforce your own knowledge. When you build a business that creates jobs, you empower entire families. But giving wasn't just about money. It could be time, skills, knowledge, or encouragement. Rich Dad said, if you're waiting to be rich before you give, you've misunderstood wealth. And the final lesson he gave Robert was perhaps the most important: take action now. So many people. Rich Dad warned, wait for the perfect time. They wait for the economy to improve, for the right idea, for a sign, and they never start. But the perfect time never comes. Action beats inaction, always. Robert took that lesson to heart. He stopped waiting. He began making small investments. He started learning aggressively, surrounding himself with mentors. They failed. He learned. He adapted, and he grew up not just financially, but as a person. In time, Robert no longer feared money. He respected it. He no longer chased security. He built freedom. He no longer relied on one income. He had many. Looking back, he realized that the story of Rich Dad, Poor Dad wasn't just about two men. It was about two mentalities: scarcity versus abundance, security versus freedom, and reaction versus creation. And today, Robert shares this message with the world. You don't need a fancy degree. You don't need to be born rich. You don't even need to be lucky. You just need the willingness to learn, the courage to act, and the discipline to persist. Because the path to wealth is not reserved for the few. It's available to anyone willing to think differently, live intentionally, and serve others. Don't with what you learn with every step, and never stop building, because at the end of the day, your time is now. Like you count.